Hi, I'm Heather Russell, Specialist of Contemporary Art at Artnet, and today I'm incredibly excited to be in the studio of Kehinde Wiley, one of the most important and exciting artists of our generation. So we're here to talk about Kehinde's work, and so thank you for having us to your beautiful studio filled with treasures, most of all you. So how long have you had this studio space? Is this your original space?
Well, this is actually a relatively new space. I've been in Brooklyn for roughly about 10 years.
Okay.
And I changed spaces like underwear. It's insane. The last space that I had was a church space, but it was very drafty.
Right.
Really muscular space, large, and really great for ambitious paintings. A lot of the work that I did on equestrian scale was done there. In this space, I wanted to concentrate a bit more on miniature, and it's still a large size space, but what I wanted to do was to concentrate on an exhibition using Memling's work. And
interesting.
Yeah, and those were all works that were done on wood panel, that were done sort of in the lap and super focused micro painting.
And isn't there a show right now of the Memling series?
That's right. That work was just at the museum in Phoenix.
That's great. And what was the reception towards that body of work?
It was fabulous.
Yeah.
Fabulous. I think one of the things that people responded to in that work was just seeing smaller scale and wondering whether or not that same level of chest beating and romanticism can come across in something of that more petite nature.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So I think for our Artnet viewers, just a brief summary. So about 2000, year 2000,
Right.
you started painting models of young black men off the streets of Harlem,
Right.
in historic poses, very often in the literal pose of very famous Western European paintings. Can you just give us a summary of kind of what inspired you to work in this manner, and a little bit about inspiration to kind of final result, and how it was to actually approach
Right.
your subjects,
Right.
and what their reactions were, etc.
That's a good question. I think that thinking about approaching complete strangers in the streets in New York is a really daunting thing.
Yeah.
And, most people say no. So what
Really?
you're looking at in the paintings is oftentimes evidence of those few people who said yes.
See
So
that?
it's a weird sort of demographic study in its own right. I graduated from Yale in 2000 and came to New York and became the artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where I began throwing away some of the lessons, many of the things that occupied my mental space as a creative person, all of the opinions of professors
Right.
and the academy, and just wanted to really delve into painting, pure painting, as whatever that means.
Right.
And for me, that meant a lot of sort of simple portraiture in relationship to the canon. And so I would just go to complete strangers in the streets, wanting to have some sort of relationship with the neighborhood that I was in. I was in
Right.
Harlem, and I'm from Los Angeles, which is, it's not a pedestrian city.
Right.
So all of a
That's a good
sudden,
point.
I'm here in New York, and there's this vibrancy, and there's this sense of life in the streets. It was very different Harlem then as well. And I wanted to sort of capture that. I wanted to be able to make really small baby steps in the direction of the world that was around me, in this weird sort of way of rebuilding my aesthetic universe after what I perceived as having been sort of slaughtered in the academy. And so, I basically tried to convince these complete strangers to come to my studio and look at art history books. And we began a conversation very slowly about why it is that I'm spending so much of my time in this room with hairy sticks and colored pastes and coaxing images into form. A lot of people just quite naturally were curious about who this guy was and what my interest was. And so the conversation about art history happened as a means of explaining
Right.
who I was. And so we would go through art history books. And then slowly it became a thing where I would allow them to choose who or how they would be posed based on their favorite paintings in those same art history books. It was this weird relay play between my taste in art history, those specific books, but also their yearnings to be seen in a certain way, but it's also based on the original portrait sitter's desire to be seen in a certain way. And so it's this echo of respectability.
And what I had heard that you had, had said to many of your subjects, look through the books and pick the image that inspires you. So I've always wondered if that was really true. So you just answered that. But
this is interesting, though. I'm glad you came to this. What I've done is I've created this narrative around how I'm finding actual people in this sort of anthropological space,
right,
where I'm going into the real world where there's actual people who are wearing these said things that day. Right? That's
right,
the received narrative. And I'd really like to interrupt that idea that you are ever capable of getting something actual in painting, the impossibility of reproduction. Art in the age of mechanical reproduction means that images can be changed and pushed through and heightened and minimized. What I try to do is I try to give you both a series of paintings that are based on the model choosing the pose, but then for every exhibition there's one or two that isn't. And so you as a viewer don't know which one you're receiving.
Right.
There's always this sense of whether or not something is authentic or something that's been fucked with somehow.
Right.
And I love that anxiety in the work.
Well, I mean, I think what makes your works more than just pretty pictures is there is that tension there. And I think there's tension on different levels that have to do with culture and Western history and the way that you empower. I mean, what I love about your work is the fact that you had the courage, really, to go into the streets. And, a lot of these young kids don't know art history, necessarily. And not necessarily because they're from Harlem, but any child, teen, that age is not going to be familiar. To give them that sense of empowerment of looking through a book and saying, I want me. That's good, that's me. It's an incredible gift.
It is.
Too.
It is. And I grew up studying art. My mother put me in art school at the age of 11 and looking at some of the great paintings in museums as a very young kid. I'm growing up in South Central Los Angeles in the 1980s. And, looking at those images and in the museum walls didn't really avail me to images of people who happened to look like me.
Right.
And so I think it is kind of a radical act to be able to see images of young black and brown people on the walls of some of the great museums throughout the world.
Absolutely.
Street casting is important also in the sense that there is no sense in which there's a hierarchy around the rich or the powerful who get to be the players within these images.
Right.
In fact, very purposefully, these are moments of absolute chance. There's someone who's minding their own business, trying to get to work, and all of a sudden, this moment of chance gets exploded into this epic, operatic moment in which he can now share his presence with the community. There's something to be said about wastefulness in this enterprise. When I was first looking at the art history books with the young men in the streets of Harlem, and they were asking me why I spent so much time in this room making these paintings and coaxing these images into the world, there was the presupposition that there was something somehow wasteful about it.
Really?
That it's a life spent in so much energy and effort. Increasingly, my project is gone global, and so I go into small villages in West Africa and in India and Sri Lanka and so on. And you'll oftentimes see people who are absolutely surprised at the model's fee, for example, that's being paid there, the cost associated with a camera crew, or with the sheer spectacle of how much is going into the creation of this portrait. Isn't that somehow wasteful? And there is always, I think, within the history of art, something very glamorous about it. And I think that glamour was always about the power of the individual to be that wasteful towards themselves.
That's a great point.
And so the power dynamic and that power play that's going on in these works, I think, have a lot to do with all of that giving going towards this one person, this one moment of chance. It's sort of a stand-in many ways for our own being in this world, the sort of sheer miracle of it.
And that's beautifully put, which is, the moment, that one chance where you cross a stranger's path, and the humanness behind that that could happen to anybody, anytime, whether it's literally in one of your paintings or in another extremely fortunate situation.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a sense of hope
Right.
that's also infused in your works that I think is, regardless of gender, regardless of race.
But I'm glad that you bring up gender, though, because gender plays a very large role in my work.
Right.
So much of my work in the very early years was about picturing black masculinity in America, which by and large had been, perceived of as being a propensity towards sports, antisocial behavior, hypersexuality. These things are things that I've dealt with as a person who inhabits a black body,
right.
And as someone who knows the truth behind that existence. I wanted to make a body of work that sort of that came to terms with the difference between images and realities. That slippage, though, is something that women certainly experience. In some of my more recent work, I've really gone into this notion of beauty and glamour and the depictions of women as objects of consumption for male gaze. And I don't want to, let me back up there, because what I meant to say is that in more recent bodies of work, I've created images of women, and I've really come to terms with the ways in which women have been painted by men as objects to be consumed.
Right.
The ways in which beauty are presupposed of women in painting is something that I play with in the depiction of men. The elephant in the living room with male portraiture is beauty. The desire to be seen as at once radiant and resplendent, but also someone who's physically alluring.
Right. And one thing that I found really fascinating in a number of your portraits of men is that they are actually, the guys, very often the female martyrs,
mm-hmm.
which I found to be kind of brilliant. And so when I see works like this, that first of all are stunning, are very visually and compositionally powerful, how have you come now to be depicting women more and more, and what can you tell us about works such as the one behind us, which is astounding?
The work behind us was actually a study, and so it's a pretty epic study.
That's
in
quite
the
a study.
What I wanted to do was to begin a conversation around fashion, and for this project, I actually partnered with Riccardo Tisci of Givenchy, and what we did was we went through the Louvre, managed to get a private audience in the Louvre, and we walked from painting to painting, looking at how fashion interacts
What
with...
an experience.
No, it was a fabulous experience.
Wow.
Not only to be able to look at all of that wonderful art with all of the time that one would desire, but also to be able to share ideas with a true creative individual whose life has been devoted to thinking about adornment,
right,
and thinking about the ways in which clothing functions as a type of armor.
It's really interesting.
The relationship between clothing and armor, and the desire to at once allure but to shut out the outside world, is one that's really interesting to me, and one that we
Super interesting.
Yeah. High fashion and couture is about exclusion.
Right.
Let's face
That's
it.
a great
It's
point.
a very expensive game. It's a very unique and small group of women who can afford this type of clothing. And it's a very special tradition,
right,
that involves a lot of hand stitching and so on, but it's exclusive. I decided to go into the streets of the Bronx, Brooklyn, Harlem, a lot of communities that don't necessarily have boutiques that would be selling this type of work. I found amazing young women who at first were a little trepidatious, but decided to follow this thing through. They came to the studio. We interviewed them. We shot initial photographs, took their measurements, and fast forward, they're having one-of-a-kind couture ball gowns being done by Riccardo for each woman. So we had conversations about who they were. And we also began playing with a lot of those images that we had seen in the Louvre, and sort of like trying to have this conversation around contemporary culture and fine art.
Fascinating. and which takes me to something that I'm really fascinated by, which is we've talked a lot about working with models from Harlem and from the Bronx and from local places in New York, but you've embarked on quite an ambitious journey over the past several years, the World Stage series. And I know you've traveled to many different countries and set up studios there. How did this idea to go from the streets of New York to really go global germinate? And also, were the countries that you traveled to predetermined? Did you? What was the process and inspiration behind this incredible and very lauded series of works that are now on view in many places?
The World Stage is a painting project that takes me all over the world, but it started as me being a working artist who was exhibiting all over the world.
That's interesting.
And so I would go to places like Paris and Berlin and Sao Paulo and recognize very early on that Black American culture vis-a-vis hip-hop had been beamed throughout the rest of the world as probably one of our most dominant cultural exports, and changed the lives of young people all over the globe. The World Stage began as a very simple provocation, but it opened up all of these doors. You know, I began to think about America's relationship to the outside world. Why choose one country over another? And it was very simply, how are we as Americans increasingly becoming aware of the outside world? And so it was not simply our impact on others, but how others are impacting us. And so it began with places like China, places like emerging markets, Brazil, Nigeria, but also looking at some of those fulcrum places politically and socially, looking at Tunisia, looking at Israel. And you know, you learn very early on that when you're in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the game is very different than that of Harlem and Brooklyn. And so what began as a simple play of places and ideas began this insane project that comprises the entire history of art. But it's also the relationship between the individual and the nation. It's the relationship between contemporary and historical cultures. And it's also a very personal and poetic journey of what it feels like to be a young Black man navigating the world in all of these new and interesting ways.
Well, congratulations. I mean, are you continuing the World Stage? That's an ongoing project?
I am. My most recent exhibition launched in London at the Stephen Friedman Gallery, which is Jamaica and the UK. And really tying, you know, I love 18th and 19th century portraiture, Gainsborough and so on. And going back to Kingston and Trenchtown and the dance hall scene, and just like capturing some of that vibrancy of young Jamaica.
That's great.
That youth, that sexual energy, that defiant sense of self and bravado. All of that came together in a really fabulous show.
That's right. Congratulations. And what a great look. I mean, Stephen Friedman, what a wonderful gallery. And to show the Jamaica series in London, I think, is a great dichotomy,
and I recently learned that exhibition, for the first time in the World Series project, will actually go back to Jamaica.
That's so great.
And so all of the young men and women who are in those paintings will be there in the room to see that.
Oh, that's a great gift.
Yeah.
And lastly, I know that you have several important shows coming up, one with Sean Kelly, 2014, 15?
That's correct.
And then you've got a big one coming up in Brooklyn.
That's correct.
2015. And I hear, I was looking at the site, it sounds like...
It's a mega show.
Do you consider it a retrospective, or is it just a major survey?
It's a major survey of 10 years of painting, right? I mean, it's kind of hard to believe, but 10 years ago, I just came out of Yale, just came into New York, and we're looking at all of the major moves within my career within that 10 years. And so it goes everything from all of the military equestrian portraits that we had done to some of the larger celebrations of religious painting, to the ceiling frescoes. You look back after all of these years and you realize that in a relatively short period of time, I've been able to scratch a lot of the surface of some of my dream areas within the history of art. Portraiture is something that is really suffering in the media environment that we have right now. You know, what I try to do in image making is try to create something that can compete on the same level, something that is as sexy and as current and as complex as the world that we all continue to evolve in.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I'm honored that we caught you while you're in New York and you're not off to another exotic locale.
Certainly.
But congratulations on everything, and it's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your time today.